So, what has Trump's strategy been towards negotiating with Putin and Zelensky, in your own words, the past few weeks? Because there's been a lot
I
of
don't,
changes.
yeah, I don't think the Trump administration has a negotiating strategy with Russia and Ukraine that we would understand in the normal sense of the word. I mean, if you think about it, we have a Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is now in its fourth year. We have Russia occupying about 25% of Ukraine. It would really like to take even more territory. You have Russia attacking Ukraine civilian areas with missile and drone strikes daily, and it has maximum aims, right? And maximum aims means, for example, not just taking this part of Ukraine and making it part of Russia, the part that it occupies, but also getting rid of the Zelensky government and removing the sanctions that are on Russia. Now, Ukraine, of course, wants to continue to exist, doesn't want to give up its territory, doesn't want to be occupied. It wants to continue to have a military which is effective, not neutered by Russia. So it wants to maintain links with partners, not just for military security, but for economic security and for political development. Now, if you were going to negotiate and all that, you would try to find a space in between those two spaces. I personally would prefer it if you took a hard line with Moscow as the aggressor, but at the very least, you go in and probably say, okay, Russia will occupy Ukraine in the near future, but we need to make sure that the rest of Ukraine continues to have security, right?
Right.
Okay. Now, that's a logical way to approach negotiations, and I can talk to you about other cases. I can talk to you about what the Biden administration did and did not do. When I say the Trump administration doesn't approach negotiations in that way, I at least mean Donald Trump doesn't approach it in that way, because he approaches this as a transaction in what he can get in terms of personal glory, power, and money. And
Mm-hmm.
so what Trump entered office with is, having been supported by Putin for almost a decade, um, all the way back to the 2016 election,
Right.
he has an affinity for Putin. So his entry point into the negotiations was not, we're going to find a space in between Ukraine and Russia. Uh, I'm going to see if I can work with Russia to get an agreement, which leads to me having the photo opportunity with Putin to celebrate this. And so the initial phase of the Trump approach was to cut off Ukraine, to cut off military aid, to cut off the sharing of intelligence, which Ukraine needs to defend itself on the front lines and
Mm-hmm.
to carry out attacks inside Russia, and to go into direct talks with the Russians. And this was in February, right? Now, that negotiation could have led to the US effectively supporting Russia's maximum demands and imposing them on Ukraine. But two things happened. One is that the Trump administration, so beyond Trump, was not unified on this. Now, there were those within the Trump administration who were either sympathetic to the Kremlin's demands, and that would be the envoy to Russia, the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, or they saw no interest in supporting Ukraine's security. That would be the vice president, J.D. Vance. But there were others within the administration who felt, no, you still have to maintain Ukraine as a sovereign country, and you still need to maintain some type of US relationship with that. So that would be, for example, Keith Kellogg, the US envoy to Ukraine. I think Mike Waltz, who was the national security advisor until last week, would be in that camp. And to an extent, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State.
Mm-hmm.
So not everybody was like, oh, we simply make the agreement with Vlad and off we go. Secondly, Russia overplayed, or the Kremlin overplayed its hand.
Okay.
The Kremlin not only maintained the demand that the parts of Ukraine which it occupies should become part of Russia,
Hmm.
And that's not just the Crimea Peninsula, that's 4 regions in
The
Ukraine.
Donbass and the eastern
Yeah,
part.
exactly. So in the eastern part, we have what's called the Donbass, that's the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. In the southern part of Ukraine, that's the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. Now, Russia has almost all of Luhansk, and it has parts of the other 3 regions, but it doesn't control all of them. But what the Kremlin was saying is, we have to have recognition that we have control of all of these regions, which Vladimir Putin had declared in September of 2022. He declared annexation of those regions.
Hmm.
Quite clearly, they wanted the sanctions removed, but they also said the Zelensky government is illegitimate. So it has to go. It has to go. Well, look, Ukraine's not going to accept those terms.
No.
Europe's not going to accept those terms. International community is not going to accept that. That's a really hard ask from the Russians. They effectively were demanding Ukraine's surrender. And so because the Russians went in with so much demands, there were others in the Trump administration who got space to say, should you really be doing it this way? Should you really be doing it through direct talks with Russia? And in that space, Ukraine worked with European leaders, especially the UK and France, at the public level. Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron giving support, saying we have to have talks in which Ukraine and Europe are involved. They have to be at the table. And we have to have a security guarantee for Ukraine. Even if the Americans are walking away, we have to have a security guarantee. We need to discuss how that would operate, but we have to have this, right?
Hmm.
And we have to maintain support for the Zelensky government. Now, they opened up talks with those, and I call them the adults in the room, in the Trump administration. Keith Kellogg, Mike Waltz, uh, elements in the State Department, elements in the Pentagon. And by the end of February, not only were Ukraine and Europe back at the table, but we had this symbolic possibility of a minerals agreement. Now, we got to the point where on February 28th, it's not Vladimir Putin in the White House, it's Vladimir Zelensky in the White House, and he's going to sign the minerals deal.
Hmm.
Now, the reason why the minerals deal is important is we can discuss what it means economically, whether or not the US is exploiting Ukraine or whether it's a fair deal. And I've got Ukrainian friends who are divided on this. But from the standpoint of Zelensky, what it did is it opened up the door to a security guarantee, at least in practice, if not formally from the Americans. Because if you are invested in taking out Ukraine's minerals, you've got to protect the infrastructure that has been set up to develop those minerals, right? Now, we know infamously on February 28th that Zelensky's desire for a security guarantee set him up for an ambush by J.D. Vance.
Yeah.
The vice president who has no interest in Ukrainian security. Vance ambushed Zelensky. Trump, who I don't think knew it was going to happen, but he immediately followed Vance in pointing the finger at Zelensky and saying, "Why are you here? Why are you demanding of this from us? You should be grateful, et cetera, et cetera." Ukrainians were thrown out of the White House. No minerals deal was signed, and we're thinking again, oh no, now it's back to supporting Russia. But again, what happens here is that Ukraine and Europe have not disappeared now. You can't make them disappear.
Hmm.
And probably if you sort of fast forward to a key point, which is in late April. So in late April, we get back to the point where Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, and the envoy to Russia, Steve Witkoff. Actually, I should get my dates precise here. It's around mid-April that
Okay.
they meet Ukraine and the European 3, UK, France, and Germany in Paris. And Rubio and Witkoff present a one-page, it's a proposal, but in effect, it's
Yeah.
almost an ultimatum from the Americans. And it has most of the Kremlin's demands in it. And that is legal recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, de facto recognition of parts of the 4 regions as part of Russia. So not legal, but we recognize it in practice. lifting of sanctions on Russia with US-Russia economic cooperation to follow, Ukraine to be demilitarized, well, Ukraine to be limited in its military,
Mm.
no NATO membership, although it can pursue membership of the EU. And Ukraine says, no, we don't want that. We don't want to give up our sovereign territory to the Russians.
Understandably so.
Understandably so. Now, in practice, the Zelensky government, I think, and I think many Ukrainians realize that they'll have to accept a Russian occupation in the short term. But it's different from accepting a Russian occupation versus giving up your sovereign claim to your territory, right?
Yeah.
So Ukraine rejects that. They reject the idea that their security guarantees are limited or that Russia has a veto over them. They reject a priority going on Russia having economic relations with the US as opposed to funds for Ukraine's recovery, in part from assets, Russian assets frozen in the West. They communicate this back to the Americans through Europe. So a week after those proposals had been issued to Ukraine and Europe, Rubio and Witkoff are supposed to go to London to get what they were hoping is an agreement. Witkoff then is going to go to Moscow and meet Putin, and Putin will say, yes, I love the agreement as well. And the Americans have wrapped it up, right? Well, all of a sudden, Ukraine has just halted that idea. So Rubio says, well, I'm not going to London. He walks out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Witkoff, this was on a Wednesday. It was on
Right.
23rd of April, 23rd of April. And so, this is on the 23rd, and Witkoff was supposed to be in Moscow by the 25th, by the Friday, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, when Rubio doesn't show up in London, I'm thinking, oh, geez, okay. Again, the Trump folks are just simply side with Putin and Zelensky becomes the bad guy. And indeed, immediately after Rubio didn't go to London, Trump is trashing Zelensky on Truth Social. On the Thursday morning, Putin makes a big mistake, huge mistake, in my opinion. Not that I'm his advisor, not that he would listen to me. Russia fires 70 missiles and 145 drones at Ukraine, and many of them target the capital, Kyiv. 12 people killed in Kyiv, 90 are injured. It's one of the worst single-day death tolls this year from missile and drone strikes. Because it's come just after the meeting in London, and everybody's wondering if there's going to be a peace deal, this attack makes international headlines.
Yeah.
If the Russians kill 12 people over in the Donbass, nobody's going to pay that much attention. Not
But
usually,
in
not that
Kyiv,
much attention. But in Kyiv, they're going
when
to
you're
pay
trying
attention
to
to
do
it,
negotiations.
where they're trying to do negotiations, and because all the journalists are there. So the journalists are in the middle of the attack, right? And so now it's like, whoa, all of a sudden, Putin has overreached. When Witkoff goes to Moscow on the Friday, Putin greets him, speaks to him in English, interesting, greets him in English, walks him over to the table. Now, on the surface, this is a victory for the Kremlin because Putin has got his top advisors there, both his top political and economic advisors. Witkoff's got no one. There's a woman who's the only person on his side of the table, and he doesn't know who she is. Wait, are you my translator? Are you from the embassy? Right?
Oh, wow.
Makes Witkoff look absolutely foolish. In fact, almost humiliated. And the
Yeah.
video is circulating. But of course, for the Trump administration, not only do they not have a deal, they look like buffoons, right? Okay, that's the Thursday and Friday. On the Saturday now, April the 26th, right?
Yeah, that's about right.
It's Pope Francis's funeral in the Vatican, right? So international leaders go to this. Macron from France, Starmer from the UK, of course, Giorgia Meloni from Italy is there. Zelensky's there. So is Trump.
Yeah.
Trump wants to be seen there. Now, there will be a 15-minute meeting between Zelensky and Trump in the Basilica of the Vatican. Now, if you watch carefully around this, the optics are very important. You're going to see the photograph from this is going to go worldwide of just these two men in this cavernous basilica with the mosaics of Jesus being baptized on the floor. And they're just sitting in for the Vatican, relatively simple chairs in the middle of this. And Trump is listening intently to Zelensky. It's a completely
Mhm.
different optic from what has happened at the end of February
Yeah.
when Vance had humiliated Zelensky. Vance isn't there. Witkoff isn't there, right?
Hmm.
Emmanuel Macron's there, however, because if you watch the video of this as they set the chairs up, Macron is there looking at what's happening, right?
Right.
The American delegation, yeah, the American delegation, the Ukrainians, and the Europeans have all stage managed this conversation. Zelensky tells Trump, look at what Russia's done rather than negotiating with you so you can play. So Zelensky has Trump there and he's saying to Trump, look, Russia is not negotiating in good faith.
Hmm.
They're not going to move to a full ceasefire, which is what you want. Look at what they did. Look at this missile attack on Kyiv, right? Trump comes out of that meeting and he goes on to Truth Social, and in a rare moment of going after Putin, he says, "Stop the attacks. What are you doing?
Hmm.
Stop these attacks." And he threatens sanctions on Russia. So we have gone from a space where April the 23rd, we're fully expecting the US, or at least the Trump administration, to side with the Kremlin. And now, only 3 days later, on the April 26th, this space is opened up where not only will the US not be siding with the Kremlin, they might wind up providing support to Ukraine.